Good morning, everyone. I'm Tegan and I'm your host for today's seminar. Firstly, I'd like to welcome everybody here in person as well as our people online. And I would like to start off by acknowledging all of the First Nations people who are the traditional custodians of the people of the land of which we live and we're meeting today. And we pay our respects to elders, both past and present. I just wanted to make everybody aware that we do have in-room mics today, so they will pick up sort of all of the noise in the background, so we keep talking to a minimum and please have your phones on silent. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's seminar. So Natasha will be presenting today on her research understanding the behavioural drivers of Indonesian transboundary fishing. Natasha has a long history here at CityU. Her research of coastal and livelihoods spans across Asia-Pacific regions and includes Indonesian and First Nations people across that area. So I'll hand it over to Natasha. Thanks, Natasha.
Thanks, Tegan. Thanks everyone for coming today, and great to see some people joining us online. I'd also like to acknowledge the Larrakia people on whose lands we meet today and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the research team members from Indonesia listed here on the slide, in particular my colleague Dr. Dedi Aduri, who I understand is with us online, and I'm sure Dedi would be available to answer any questions from the Indonesian side of things at the end of the seminar as well. And I'd also like to acknowledge his colleagues from the National Research and Innovation Agency, Ronnie, as well as colleagues from the University Nusa Cendana based in Kupang, CDU alumni Dr. Ria Fitriana, and also Dr. Carly McKenna, who was a major contributor to this research, who's now a real adjunct. I'd also like to note for our Indonesian colleagues today or tomorrow morning, as I understand the Indonesian government's just announced, is the end of Ramadan, the fasting month, and it's actually the beginning of celebrations, the Eid al-Fitr celebrations in Indonesia, and Eid Mubarak to all of those from Indonesia joining us today. So since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, Australia experienced a new surge in levels of illegal fishing activity in the Australian fishing zone, and particularly talking today about small-scale fishing. Both Australia and Indonesia have previously identified the need for more effective long-term solutions to support this ongoing issue of illegal fishing, and particularly to support the sustainable livelihoods and well-being of coastal fishing communities in Indonesia and particularly in East Indonesia. However, as our research has shown, and I've been working on this topic since I first came to CDU in 1993, despite a lot of scholarly attention over the last 30 years, but with limited attention actually in the last 10 to 15 years, the situation is socially, economically and politically complex. Therefore, identifying mechanisms to achieve enduring solutions has proven challenging. So because of this surge in illegal activity during COVID, we were contracted by ACR, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, to undertake a small research activity to explore some of the drivers in this recent surge in illegal activity since COVID, and doing so with a team of Indonesian colleagues working collaboratively with the aim to explore the numerous drivers and conditions that have led to a recent increase in illegal activity from 2020 onwards, present an analysis of the results, as well as look at some opportunities for addressing some of the behavioural drivers in the context of potential livelihood improvements, as well as to build some research knowledge and capacity around the topic. So just to look at some of the figures since COVID, this graph here only is accurate up until about early 2025. But basically, you can see prior to COVID, numbers of illegal fishing incursions in terms of apprehensions were quite low and had been reasonably low since around 2006, 2007, 2005, 6, 7, when there was the last big surge in illegal activity. And you can see it's sort of a steady increase from 2021, the next financial year, up until 2024-25. I haven't got the full data set here, but I understand there's about 300 vessel incursions in the last financial year. And since July 2025, there's been about 130 Indonesian fishers prosecuted through the courts. The issue attracts quite a lot of media attention, as well as international discussions between Australia and Indonesia, who have strong commitments to do something about this issue over time. And since COVID, initially a lot of the illegal activity was happening down off the Kimberley region, but over the last few years it's spread from that sort of Rolly Shoals, Kimberley area across to the top end of Arnhem Land, and most recently to an increase in activity in the Torres Strait region. And there's been quite a lot of media just in the last 2 months about illegal incursions, not only in the waters but on the land in the Torres Strait. And we've seen that previously during COVID, most of the responses by the government was in the form of legislative forfeitures. And but more recently, there's now more apprehensions and prosecutions occurring through the courts. So our project had a number of elements to it, a number of activities. We started off with this desktop review of what we know about Indonesian fishing activity over the mostly in the last 30 years, but going back 50 years, and compiling some data on illegal fishing trends. And AFMA supplied some data for us from 2012. I did quite a comprehensive review of what past livelihood interventions had been implemented in some of the origin villages where we know fishers come from, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. As part of the project, we're applying a behavioural science sort of conceptual framework to try and understand the drivers of illegal fishing in a lot more detail. We also looked at how transboundary fishing, whether it's legal or illegal fishing, sits within the broader livelihood portfolio, so the annual or multi-annual livelihood portfolios of communities within Nusa Tenggara Timor, where we worked. The major part of the work was then identifying multiple actor-based or opportunity-based drivers of illegal fishing. We also wanted to find out about fishers and other actors' perceptions on risks engaging in illegal activity. What are some of the decision-making issues around that, and what are the impacts of apprehensions on fishers and their families? And then we've made a number of recommendations as to how governments, researchers and communities may work together to address some of these drivers and livelihood improvements. And we produced quite a substantial report, about 250 pages of this information, and we have a first paper based on the first part of the results, the behavioural drivers, that was published a couple of months ago, which I've got a reference to that at the end. So this was very much a collaborative methodology and approach with our Indonesian colleagues who led the field work in the communities in Indonesia, and the Australian team led the literature reviews. We conducted joint data analysis and write-up in lovely places like Bali. And one thing that we did do at the end of the data analysis and drafting of the results was go back to the 4 communities that we worked in and share the results back with the research participants and the local government. And that was very well received, because often communities don't get the opportunity to actually have have a review of the information that was collected from them and validate it. So the 4 communities we worked in for this project are in Nusa Tenggara, Timor, and the team worked in a village called Owasapa, which is just on the outskirts of Kupang, a major fishing village there where fishers from that community tend to operate along the border region between Australia and Indonesia, fishing for trepang or vegetable. We also worked in a village called Owalaba in Roti Island, which is one of the communities where boats are active in the Memorandum of Understanding area in the Timor Sea, operating a traditional fishery. And the other site was the village of Papela or Tanjung Pasir, which is kind of like a main fishing base or community for both legal and illegal fishers, and an area where I worked back in the mid-90s. As part of the field research led by the Indonesian team under ethical and research permits from both Australian human ethics and Indonesian human ethics organisations, we interviewed just over 200 people, either focus group discussions or key informant interviews. And our research participants, we wanted to also get perspectives from women or female members of fishers or boat captains or boat owners as well. But most of the people we spoke to were men in those 4 villages. So just a few key points of the review that we did looking at legal and illegal fishing trends in the Australian fishing zone and responses to that over time. So we do know that there's surges of illegal activity inside the Australian fishing zone in different places in response to a whole range of different social and economic drivers. And you can see trends in this over the last 50 years, and there's a lot more detail about this in our report. You know that there was quite high surges of illegal activity in the 1990s. Indonesia were targeting things like troker shell, as well as trepang, and in the 2000s, shark fin, and so on. So this recent surge is not anything new. We do know that compliance policy has had impact at times in reducing activity, particularly in 2005, 6, 7, where the compliance response was really much focused on apprehensions and prosecutions through the courts as opposed to legislative forfeitures or seizure of catch and equipment at sea. And different conditions can trigger new surges of activity. We know that some of the illegal fishers currently include participants that have a historic interest in the Timor Sea, that we categorise as the traditional fishers that have operated, or their family members, generational family members, have operated in and around the Timor Sea for many decades. But there's other new entrants that are continually entering in the fishery, but it's a very complex situation. You've got lots of different fishing communities around eastern Indonesia, different ethnic groups operating within different social and economic networks, targeting different species. So it makes it a very difficult issue to deal with when you have such diversity and complexity. One of the issues that we looked at as well was that, just put this slide up here for those of you that aren't familiar with the 1974 Memorandum of Understanding Agreement that was signed between President Suharto and Gough Whitlam 50 years ago, which acknowledged that Indonesia, at the time, Indonesians had an interest in Timor Sea, and that under the agreement, fishers would be permitted to operate within a 12 nautical mile of these key reefs and islands in the Timor Sea based on historic interest in the region, documented up until the as far back as the late 1700s as well. And under that agreement, fishers were allowed to access a variety of species, but access is only determined by sail-powered vessels. Non-motorised vessels are allowed to access or enter that area, and that's still in place. That technological restriction is still in place today. In 1989, the government established a box area under the MOU agreement, and that is now the area that traditional Indonesian fishing is allowed to operate in, but under the same conditions as established in 1974, only allowed to use motorised boats. That fishery, if you like, generally operates as an open access fishery. There's restrictions on what can be accessed or where fishers can go in terms of some of the park areas within that area, but essentially there's no restrictions on quota or take, and as long as you're in a sail-powered boat, you're allowed to operate in that area. So that area still exists today under those agreements. As part of that 1989 agreement, Australia and Indonesia agreed to cooperate to develop alternative income generating projects for fishers in eastern Indonesia that have traditionally fished in this area. So this is kind of what it looks like today. These maps are available in Bahasa Indonesian as well, but it shows across that border zone where fishers are allowed to fish inside the Australian fishing zone, inside areas where Indonesia owns the water column, Australia owns the seabed, and so on. So it's quite a complex area, as well as different marine parks in that area have no-go zones and specific restrictions on what can be taken. Denny's team produced some maps which show some of the origin communities, if you like, where some fishers come from and some of the key fishing grounds that they target. So you can see boats come from a wide range of areas in eastern Indonesia, particularly from the Sulawesi region up here. And we see a lot of the most recent illegal fishing apprehensions are most likely boats coming from this area up here. And some of the kind of different groups target kind of different types of products and fishing grounds in the Australian fishing zone. And just a couple of tracks here. These tracks don't show the most recent targeted areas into Arnhem Land and across to the Torres Strait. But you can see it's quite a complex area. So one of the main aims of our project was to take a behavioural science approach to understand the causes of illegal fishing to address this non-compliance, and Kylie McKenna led this work. We look at how non-compliance is framed in the broader literature. Generally, illegal fishing is viewed as a security threat or a crime, and it's often linked with organised crime, which is often, I guess, incorrect. We also know that illegal fishing, some researchers have conceptualised it as a wicked problem, which kind of then sort of makes it one of those issues that's quite intractable to actually do anything about, but it also acknowledges the complexity around the issue of illegal fishing. Most of the literature refers to illegal fishing and the way it's managed through an instrumental or deterrence approach, which that kind of approach is informed by rational choice theory, which basically assumes that non-compliant behaviour is based on assessment as to whether the perceived benefits of committing the crime will outweigh the perceived costs. So factors influencing the cost-benefit analysis by fishers might include, for example, degree of effort involved in getting the illegally caught species to the intended markets, the availability of the resources sought, regardless of the effort, and the possible risks of being caught. So that's generally how illegal fishing has been perceived in the literature. But if we go deeper into the literature, we show that there's a growing scholarship that indicates fisher and other actors involved in illegal fishing, that their decision-making is much more nuanced and is motivated by much more specific illegal fishing drivers. And there's some recent work that's been done globally on this, where, such as work by Batista and others, sort of tried to develop some new frameworks to capture this nuance. And basically, their work looks at actor-based drivers are enabled by broader social, economic and political contexts in which people live and work. And that if you can implement some interventions that are specifically addressing these drivers or enabling factors, then you've got a much more better chance of trying to reduce implement compliance. So we looked at that approach, and we also drew on this other theory around behavioural drivers, trying to understand why people do what they do. And the work by Petit, which they undertook a very big analysis of decision-making and behavioural theories and frameworks, and they basically developed this framework that refers to these level 1 or high-level drivers, as well as beneath these level 1 drivers, a larger number of level 2 dimensions, where each driver is unpacked into several dimensions. So under this behavioural drivers model, Petit, they sort of identified behavioural drivers fitting into psychology, sociology or environmental areas. We took that framework and expanded on it in our work. So in summary, we basically adopted this conceptual framework that tried to identify actor-based drivers, or the underlying motivations that drive individual actors to undertake non-compliance or illegal fishing activity, but recognising that those drivers operate within a much broader enabling environment. And so non-compliance or illegal fishing activity is the interaction between these two areas. Because what we've found is that sometimes the actor-based approaches unintentionally place the burden on the individual fisher without understanding what situation is sitting behind that creates the opportunity for non-compliance. So we undertook the fieldwork in Indonesia, interviewed and spoke to a couple of hundred people to try and understand these underlying motivations for illegal fishing. And this slide shows our 7 categories of these level 1 drivers. So you'll see the Petit model had sort of 3 main categories, but we expanded this to look at economic and livelihood related drivers, drivers related to the COVID-19 pandemic, because that was part of our brief, was to look at why fishing had increased, illegal fishing had increased since COVID, some of the psychological factors, as well as environmental factors, cultural, historical factors, social factors, as well as the policy and management around illegal fishing, that was contributing to illegal fishing since COVID. So we basically came up with these 7 level 1 drivers and about 28 level 2 drivers. And so the picture basically shows there's a very complex situation of a complex interplay of drivers and enablers, some blurring between the two, to try and understand non-compliance as an interaction of a motivated actor of an opportunity. So I don't have time to go through all of these in detail, but basically, obviously, the opportunity to undertake illegal fishing with the prospect of earning a substantial amount of money in a short period of time for trepan, for example, which commands a very high price on international markets, is a driver. But there's, people fishers might also desire to undertake, a fishing activity that was also driven by psychological reasons, for example. So we know that young men are quite, keen to undertake these adventures as well for a whole range of reasons. Some fishers are making decisions about illegal fishing because they have a long historical connection, and generational relationship to fishing in Australian waters. They also have practical knowledge and skills to undertake it. There's also, I guess, social or spiritual reasons around undertaking illegal activity. And in the case of our research specifically, in terms of why there was a lot of illegal activity during COVID, was because at the time the Border Force and AFMA were implementing social distancing, and so there was a more lenient treatment of fishers at sea. So there's a whole range of drivers which are quite difficult to disentangle, and there is some degree of overlap, but they do work together to form human behaviour. So as part of our research, we also looked at this opportunity context, but in less detail. And I think it's really something that we need to look at in a bit more detail. But there's no doubt that the broader institutional governance or social environment that people live their lives in also influences people's decision-making about engagement and legal activity. And one of the big ones is this patron-client relations or credit-debt relations. So most of the communities that we work with in Eastern Indonesia, everyone has debt. Everyone relies on credit to undertake their livelihood activities. And we've got some really interesting research happening at RIEL at the moment by one of my PhD students, Yanti Bianti, who's looking at women's reliance on debt and coping strategies. So women and men undertake get into debt to support their livelihood activities for a whole range of reasons, mostly because they don't have opportunities to access other forms of credit. So we find that nearly everyone in these communities has some kind of form of debt, and so that is also a really important enabling factor within these communities that we worked in. We know that there's limited livelihood opportunities in some of these communities, and we know that there is that strong connection amongst some communities with the historic traditions of fishing in the Australian waters. So there's all these drivers that we've identified. People make decisions, but within full knowledge of the risks that they're undertaking. So this slide actually is a memorial to 8 fishers that lost their lives in a cyclone in the Timor Sea from one of the villages on Roti. But basically the actor-based drivers are informed by these risks and people's decision-making about whether to engage in illegal fishing. So we tried to identify some of these risks. We met one fisher who had been subject to attack by crocodiles, Arnhem Land, and had somehow made it back to Roti with very serious injuries, stitched up at the local clinic and somehow managed to survive. But we know that there are others that have died. So there's a whole range of risks that people identify that interact with these actor-based motivations in taking decisions. We're really interested in whether women have any influence in decision-making, whether they're male members going fishing, particularly illegal in Australian waters, in sort of knowledge of one knowing about the risks involved, yet people still make decisions to engage in illegal activity. And, you know, a few of the quotes, some of the women, things like, I cannot influence my husband's decision to cross the border. If there is no money, I will tell my husband to sail to the border. Another woman said, I prohibit cross-border fishing activities as the wind is too strong. Another one said, I persuade my son-in-law not to go across the borders in case of experiencing the same incident as my late husband, and so on. So people do, where people fish and how they end up is influenced by a whole range of situations as well. We also did a little bit of work with the research participants to try and understand a bit more about the impacts of apprehensions on households. And I guess, again, one of the big messages that came out of this work was that particularly where people are living in a debt-based environment, when people have unsuccessful fishing voyages, whether it's through apprehensions or other issues, often the burden of having to pick up the pieces falls to the women, and that women have to take on extra work, have to borrow extra money, and that can create mental health and stress, and people just get further and further into debt. And the most cited impact of apprehensions is the need for families to borrow money to pay off the debt, which then creates more debt, which then the driver of potentially going to fish and earn a lot of money in a short period of time is appealing. So you can see that there's this kind of cyclic situation going on. And we also wanted to try and understand what people in the communities thought about government policy around fisheries management. It wasn't super comprehensive, but one of the messages that was received was that the public information campaigns that have been implemented in Indonesia jointly by Australian-Indonesian government aren't really operating as much of a deterrent to illegal fishing. So there's opportunities to do other types of activities that might have some greater impact. So just to turn to some of our conclusions and recommendations, there's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic provided an opportunity for an increase in illegal activity by some groups, but at the same time, for some of the core communities that we worked in, transboundary fishing, it's legal or illegal, is still a really important role in people's livelihood portfolios and strategies, and that people also step in and out of this transboundary fishing from year to year or over different years, but it's still a very much important part of people's lives. The work that I mentioned earlier, looking at, so we know that this issue of illegal fishing has been a problem for many decades. We know that there was commitments made many decades ago to implement some livelihood support and community development work in some of these historic fishing communities. And our review of that showed that basically there'd been very few initiatives trialled over the decades. Any that had been implemented had limited community engagement in design, which is kind of a set up to fail from the very beginning. Many of them have been poorly designed without actually clear impact pathways or goals. Many of them were implemented with limited understanding of people's actual livelihoods and socio-economic, cultural situations, not following particularly well-established livelihood frameworks and approaches that are quite commonly used in other parts of the world. There's been a potentially misplaced focus on alternative livelihoods compared to, for example, focusing on strengthening existing livelihoods. So many of these communities engaging in domestic fisheries activity as well as transboundary fishing. Many of the communities have issues around the value chain, things like getting access to markets, being able to get good prices, having good storage facilities for fish and so on. So we feel that some of the areas that could be focused on is actually strengthening people's roles in the domestic fisheries as well. Many of the initiatives that have been trialled in some of these communities have been really small amounts of money, like $10,000, $20,000, compared to much more substantial investment. They've been short-term, and very few of them were actually monitored or evaluated to see if they're actually successful. And finally, one of the other key factors that some of the implementing agencies for some of these initiatives weren't always the best ones that should be delivering community development villages. So there's some real opportunities there to do something better. So in terms of our recommendations then, moving forward, so our project was a scoping study, but we've definitely identified a whole range of areas that could be trialled to try and have some influence in reducing illegal activity, but also recognising that many of these places are pretty marginal places. Communities are often marginalised, discriminated against, they're remote, there's limited services and support in these places. So anything that I think could be implemented in these communities would definitely have benefits as well. So some of our recommendations were to try and identify these really important actor-based drivers and implement some programs to address those. Obviously, we need to continue our compliance efforts as well, but there's lots of opportunities to trial some activities in these communities. We came up with some research questions that could be addressed in terms of a research development type project, which I won't go into here, but basically in terms of trying to enhance household or community-based livelihoods, we felt that if you're implementing a project grounded in these behavioural science or change approaches, that would provide an opportunity to implement some long-term initiatives that would have a chance of actually having an impact, integrating those behavioural change approaches with sustainable livelihood diversification approaches which are used all around the world, try and implement projects that have more of a learning focused approach as well. And these are not approaches that are necessarily new. We know that many of these types of projects are operating already in parts of Asia Pacific, but interestingly, there's been no substantial projects like this implemented in Eastern Indonesia in some of these communities. So let's try it. Let's give it a go. Some of the main drivers we just suggested we could focus on would be the economic and livelihood drivers, some of the social drivers, the cultural historical drivers, and some of the policy and management drivers. Came up with some more detail about suggestions for learning and support activities, which are common approaches already in existence in other types of projects around the region. Things like vocational education training for some of the youth. I mean, we see that many young men, for example, don't have opportunities to pursue education and other areas. They end up just going into fishing activity by default. Some prefer that, others happen to try something else. In the past, there's been a number of projects that have just been subsidised from the government or handing out fishing act gear in the idea that, if you give someone a fishing net or a boat that they'll stop fishing legally, and that hasn't really been successful. And there's a lot of capacity building opportunities as well. We feel that operating in some of these key communities in Eastern Indonesia, where we know a lot of the legal and illegal fishers come from, the great opportunities. And I think there's also opportunities for some of the data management on illegal fishing to improve, which would provide an opportunity to look at sort of collect some baseline data which could inform long-term monitoring programs and be able to compare that with whatever program interventions are happening in Indonesia. One of the sticklers is this 1974-1989 agreement that hasn't been changed essentially for 50 years. So far there doesn't seem to be any desire on either side of the border to do anything about that, but it definitely creates an issue at a whole range of different areas for some of the historic fishers that demonstrate historic interest in this region. Debbie and Ronnie and I presented the results of our research to the Australian Embassy and different departments there last November, as well as to the Indonesian government. And we're waiting to find out whether we are able to take the recommendations a bit further and potentially, hopefully, demonstrate opportunities for some follow-on work, and in particular to address some of our recommendations and to try and undertake some research that could address these high precarious livelihoods of communities in Nusa Tenggara Timor. So that's it from me. Just some acknowledgements there to ACR, obviously to the communities who participated in the research and were very generous with their time and knowledge and perspectives, to AFMA for providing some compliance data. Our full report and first publication are there on the screen as well. Thank you very much.
We're going to have some time for questions now. I am going to take the opportunity to ask the first one. Okay. Just on that, you mentioned about the long period of no changes to the MOU. Do you think that a change to allow powered boats would have any impact on that illegal fishing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Potentially for some groups, yes, and for some other groups, but perhaps not. And we have made a number of recommendations in previous decades as to how some changes could be made to the arrangements around the MOU box. Some of these have been thought about in quite a lot of detail by other colleagues that have worked in this area. But we do think that providing secure rights within managed fisheries for some groups, historic interest in the area, could at least provide more secure livelihoods. But there's nothing to say that that would stop other groups, new entrants, still fishing illegally in Australian waters.
Okay, I might open it up to the room first for questions here in the room. Alan?
Thanks, Natasha. That was really interesting. And so obviously you're talking about incursions in Australian waters, but to what extent are the fishers going elsewhere to other transboundary areas and doing illegal fishing there?
Yeah. Look, I can't comment specifically, but I do know when I was doing work in this area in the 1990s that some of the fishing communities I were working with were going to places like, or had been to places like Palau from Indonesia. But I think there has been also fishers going into Malaysian waters, but I'm not quite sure if they're more sort of industrial size boats as opposed to small scale artisanal boats. But certainly for Eastern Indonesia, Northern Australia, Papua New Guinea has been a key area for transboundary fishing for a long, long time.
I just wonder, what are the unique risks in the Australian water where the transboundary fishing often happens? So obviously being caught by the border patrol is one unique risk in this area. But something like weather or crocodile or these things, are there any other unique risks in this area?
Well, running out of fuel, water, food, issues with the boat would be some of the other risks.
That basically is the risks related traveling too long.
Many of the communities are engaged in this transboundary fishing. That's a distant shore fishing or long distance fishing is very much a key livelihood activity, and many of these communities have migration as part of their livelihood activity. So people travel, families travel in small boats for days and days at a time to move to other places where they can access resources and fish. So it's not really seen as a risk per se, because it is part of people's, regular livelihood portfolio, inshore fishing, nearby reef fishing, as well as distant shore fishing.
Thanks, Natasha. Really interesting and comprehensive bit of work. I'm just wondering if you had any insight about what the actual potential impact of this fishing is having on the fisheries resources, and whether or not it's minor and it's kind of just a big political issue, or is it likely to be kind of an important sustainability issue?
I can't answer that. I don't have the data. I know there was some work done some years ago looking at the shark fisheries and impact on shark species. There have been surveys done at places like Scott Reef and Ashmore Reef, because Scott Reef, under the MOU box area and the Timor Sea, is still accessed by traditional fishers, or by fishers sailing down with crews and spending, up to a month there. They walk on the reef. There's no restrictions on how much they can harvest. So more than likely that there is some issues there. But again, under the MOU arrangement, it's an open access fishery. There's no rights specifically afforded to any of those groups that actually have a historic interest, and no quotal management. So, potentially opportunities for some co-management, community-based management have been raised previously, but it's seen as a difficult issue to revisit the agreement and to go through that process of changing arrangements. But I don't know what the impact would be on other marine resources. Yeah. Sam?
Probably kind of a simple and naive question, but from the work you've done, do you have a sense of, in some ways, if we completely took our eye off the ball and didn't do any deterrence or enforcement, what's the potential scale of the issue? Is it likely to be something that people would do a lot more of if there was no deterrence to it, or it's kind of as high as we'll ever get? And there may be lots of other perspectives on that in this room, but
I think we definitely see higher numbers if there was no deterrence. I think it's just evident by some of the brazen actions that fishers have been, doing in the last year or so, that perhaps the likelihood of getting caught at the moment is actually seen as not that high. I mean, it's a huge area for government to manage. It's almost, it's a porous border. It's almost impossible. One of the things that some of the people we spoke to also said that there was, some of the village elders in particular said that some areas that were contributing to the illegal activities, limited efforts on the Indonesian side of the border as well to deter activity, but also potentially difficult, large area to control. And a question up back there.
Yeah, so in the some of the alternatives that was mentioned, that there could be development work done in fisheries in those places. Is there capacity in those fisheries to do that, or are they fished down to a point where any further exploitation probably have a high effort to low catch ratio to the point where it's not worth it? Because surely if the catch effort ratio was better there, would they not save the fuel and the risk and fish there anyway?
Yeah, I mean, we'd actually like to undertake the valuations assessment to get a better idea of some of the value chains, but essentially we're not really talking about sort of opening up new fisheries or exploiting existing fisheries. We're really talking about strengthening people's roles along the value chain. So one of the constraints, say, for communities for fishers in Papella and Tanjung Pasir and Roti is that they engage in a lot of tuna fishing, but they don't have access to good ice supplies and storage facilities, and the best prices for their fish are available in Kupang, which is a couple of hours away by boat. So, for example, if you could potentially, sure, it's not going to give you the same amount of income as, a ton of trepang, but if you can try and improve the market price of some of these species, for some people, that would at least, theory, improve their, household income and livelihoods, which may then reduce people going into debt or may have an impact on decision making to go illegal or not.
This is a question from Timothy online. He says there have been some Indonesian fishers turning up in Torres Strait and the Cape. Do you have any idea if these are the same group or potentially from other regions such as West Papua?
Yeah, more than likely not from West Papua, and more than likely from some of the other villages in southeast Sulawesi.
Thanks. Just wondering how coordinated are these guys? Like is it on the one end of the spectrum? Half a dozen blokes jumping in a boat and going hell for leather across the ocean versus more sophisticated sort of mothership operations. Sort of which end of the spectrum do they typically sit?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any information about motherships in terms of the communities that we work with and the type of fishing that we were focusing on. But look, there's social and economic rules around how crews come together, the financial arrangements between boat owners and fishers, between the traders that purchase the products. So, I mean, it's organised. Some boat owners have difficulties recruiting crew. Others, it's quite a well-established kind of group of people that people draw on. I mean, some of the people I work with, I'm now working with the grandchildren of my key research participants from 30 years ago. So, people are still operating legally and illegally in this area over generations. The village of Oalaba in Roti, they're mostly sailboat legal fishers operating in the MOU box, although a few of them may have engaged in a little bit of illegal activity during COVID when the enforcement policy was a bit more lenient. Many of the crew now from that community are actually being drawn from a couple of villages in the Alor Pantar region of eastern Indonesia. So they're actually crews coming over for 3 or 4 months of the year from other islands to crew specifically owned boats in that village. And that's been quite well established for at least the last 10 years or so. So there is organisation around the different fisheries. One area we didn't, a whole range of obvious reasons, we didn't spend a lot of time talking to some of the traders and the bosses. So obviously there's a whole range of issues there, but they're obviously a key player and need to be involved in any of the kind of solutions or interventions. They're the ones that are often financing some of the voyages. They're also purchasing the catches and then trading them through Indonesia for international markets.
Thanks, Natasha. That is really interesting. But just sitting here thinking and following up on Kella's question, if there's no information on what's happening with the resource, and given that in Australia, to my knowledge, decisions about fisheries are made based on, what fishery to close, if that species is declining, etc., are all based on a knowledge of the resource and I guess fundamentally the ecology of things. But this, from what you said, this is just political, that it's just illegal because it's Australian waters. that people are coming into. Is that true? Is that really, this is a political issue?
Illegal fishing.
Because it's Australian waters. So it's without knowledge of what it's doing to the resource. I find that, well, not surprising actually, but worrying that there's not more information coming out about what really that fishing is doing to the fisheries resources and ecology of reefs in that whole area.
There has been work done around the offshore reefs and the offshore WA as part of the MOU. Yeah, I mean, one perspective, government may disagree, is that up until, well, we have these surges of illegal activity. Obviously, we've got a lot of illegal activity over the last few years. Prior to that, there wasn't that much based on the apprehensions. Whether there was, more illegal activity going on that we didn't know about, we don't know. But one perspective on that is that the actual level of illegal activity has been low enough to not warrant any major impact on the species being targeted. So, we can afford to lose a little bit without it having a major impact. But also remember that tree punk is not a targeted resource apart from there's 7 tree punk licences in the Northern Territory. I'm not sure about Western Australia, but we don't actually have a major fishery here. So you could say it's an underexploited resource, which is why Indonesians know that there's a lot of tree punk here. They've been fishing for tree punk for hundreds of years. It's a known fact. So perhaps the illegal take is actually quite small compared to.
This is a comment, but maybe you have some thoughts on this. This is from Jeremy, who's online from Rote. He said he met several new fishers from 2 other villages on Rote who started to go fishing in the MOU box after suffering declining catches after the 2022 Seroja cyclone hit Rote and destroyed marine resources around their area. Any thoughts?
We do know that in our research that yes, the impacts of Cyclone Seroja were felt by many of the communities, and some communities also have small seaweed farms going on at the same time, so that domestic fisheries engagement. But that particular event did have a major impact on a number of communities as well. And I guess illustrative of, people engage in illegal fishing in response to a whole range of issues, including things like COVID and natural disasters.
Last question.
Thanks, Natasha. I'm just wondering what happened when these illegal fishers get caught in Australian waters. Do they get deported immediately? Do they go to jail for a couple of times? And do you think the punishment is not hard enough for the repeated offenders to keep doing this illegal fishing?
Yeah, so I didn't go into the apprehensions side of things, but basically there's 2 main approaches depending on the type of charge, type of illegal fishing, mostly under the Fisheries Management Act, but as I understand there's also charges under parks and other acts. But basically if the Border Force decides to apprehend a fisher or crew, bring them to Darwin, they will be charged with offences under the Act. The captain of the boat is often charged with additional offences to the crew. If they haven't been apprehended previously, they'd be put on a good behaviour bond and returned to Indonesia. The good behaviour bond would normally be for $1,000 or $2,000. If they reoffend, instead of paying the fine, they might then serve some jail time. So, for example, I had a message from one of my friends in Roti last Friday who was looking for information about a captain of a boat who was apprehended for illegal fishing, I think in Arnhem Land at the end of last year. His family hadn't heard from him, and they were wanting to know whether I knew anything what happened to him. Now, as it turned out, the captain of the boat, he was a reoffender. He's gone to jail for 4 months because he'd originally been caught illegal fishing, had been given a good behaviour bond, sent back to Indonesia. A couple of years later, he's reoffended. He's done a term in Darwin Correctional Centre at the moment. So, but most fishers are returned home within 4 weeks. I think that's a requirement under the immigration law, but are held in detention until their cases are heard in Darwin courts. Most of the Darwin courts. Yeah, it's quite complicated legally.
Okay, we will have time for more questions with Natasha at morning tea. So if you do have some more questions, feel free to join us at morning tea. You can just follow the crowds. But I would like to give Natasha a little token of thanks. And I want to thanks, Natasha. Let's give Natasha one more thank you. And we do have a break in our seminar series for Easter, and we will be returning on the 17th of April with one of our PhD students, Emily. Thanks.
They know each other.
Lost findings.
Yeah.